What's up? It's Chris from Brooklyn Wildlife, also co-founder of Black Land Ownership. Of course, I got cut off right when I was getting into it. But basically, at the end of that last live, I was talking about like Black land ownership and the need for like land ownership and how our environmental concerns and how it relates to this idea of environmentalism and what do we do in terms of trying to affect the environment and the changes in the climate and everything like that. And one of the things is to get away from these mega farms and get away from this idea of one company owning 50,000 acres, 100,000 acres, and getting to dictate everything that happens on that land. And that if you have more black people that are small farmers and more black people that are involved in farming, then we're going to get healthier food. We're going to have more control over what happens in some of these rural areas. And you're not going to have that divide of like the only places, quote unquote, safe for us are the cities. You know, it's 2019, about to be 2020. We can't only be in the major cities on the east and west coast, and we're getting pushed out of them anyway due to gentrification. So why aren't we taking advantage of cheaper prices of land out in more rural areas and getting involved in some of the businesses that we used to dominate? To get into some factual information, there were more black farmers and there was more acreage owned by black people at the end of the 1890s than now. How does that make sense? A person would say, oh, well, that's because of urbanism and people leaving rural areas. No. It's not like that land just ended up empty and no one owns it. Non-black people own it now, and they're utilizing it and making money off of it that we're not. I don't know how many people have their colleges and their academic experiences paid for by their parents selling off land in the middle of nowhere that may not have even been used for the past 80 years, 100 years in the family, but it freed up capital to then make sure those kids aren't in debt for the rest of their lives. So when we think about why we need land is serious, and when we think about like some of these environmental conversations, like overpopulation is a problem. Overpopulation is not a problem for black people. We need more black people. If you look at our current president, he's not letting people come from countries where people are black. All right, he's not letting people of African descent come to this country. So we're gonna look up, and there are gonna be fewer and fewer and fewer black people here. So if we are having kids, what are we doing with them? Putting them in 4-bedroom apartments in every major city and only 10 cities around the country instead of using all this land that's out here. When we think about, we weren't trying to build oil lines through the Native Americans' lands up in North and South Dakota. That's not us. But we also don't own the land, so we're displaced by it. We're affected by it. The indigenous folks are affected by it. When you look at what's happening with a lot of the climate issues, we don't get to dictate what's going on because we don't own the land. We can't tell these corporations they need to regulate themselves better. We're not able to say that, you can't pollute in the way you have been. You can't, get into fracking. You can't let the oil get dumped into the Gulf Stream. You're not allowed to do certain things because we don't own the land. We don't get to dictate what these people are doing. And the people that own the land are huge corporations, and it works to their benefit to continue their practices, which might poison us. And so we have to think about taking responsibility in that. And as a worldwide issue of solidarity, you think about black land ownership worldwide, it's like, there are places in Africa where outsiders own more of the land than the Africans there. If you look at what happened in Australia with the Aboriginals, when you look what happened in America with the indigenous, when you look what happened in the Southwest with people who are now called Mexicans getting pushed out of Texas, getting pushed out of Nevada, getting pushed out of California, and now when they try to come back, they're immigrants and they're not having access to the land. So as a human rights issue, this concept of people of African descent and dark-skinned people all around the world being displaced and being marginalized and being landless is a serious issue. And whenever you look at people who are landless or aren't able to own the land, then they have issues related to health and nutrition. They have issues related to the police occupying their territories. They have issues related to lack of access to financial equality, and so it's really a big issue. And if folks are like, well, isn't black land ownership somehow going to repeat what has happened with the people of European descent and create this idea of us versus them? That's not how it works. Like, if you think about almost any of the black organizations are there because of safety, and we're there and developed in order to like have a safe space for ourselves. But we're not exclusive like that. Like, black colleges, white people can go to black colleges. There's a time period where at the white colleges, black people couldn't go to them. See how that works differently? So you think about black land ownership, one of my partners is a white woman. So inherently, it brings up conversations of solidarity, and it brings up conversations of working together across communities. and thinking about historically, well, how are women kept out of property ownership? And also having the real conversation of, well, how are white women benefited by white supremacy in that when their parents die, they inherit land from their dad. Or if they married and then get a divorce, they get money and land from that white man. And that doesn't happen the same way with black folks. And then have that real conversation. One of my other partners is an immigrant, and his family is from Russia. And we get into real conversation. We're talking about land and how land was taken over there and the enclosure movements, and how once you come to America, if you are an immigrant, how easy or not is it to then get into the property ownership game. And so the black land ownership issue is about solidarity. It's about working cross community. It's about working with people of different backgrounds and seeing the connective parts of this. And again, thinking about the history and the timeline. And then folks are like, well, yo, if black people don't own land, that's their fault. It's like, actually, nah, man. All you have to do is a little bit of history, a little bit of research, and you'll see how much effort was put into displacing black people from owning land. First off, I don't believe that all the black people here came via slavery. There were black people in the Americas before the Europeans got here. That's historically known. There were black people that came as free people during the time period of slavery. Now, they had to watch out because there were laws that said, well, you snatch up a black person and take them to a slave state, they can be a slave again. So, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. When you think about property ownership and land ownership, well, what happens when people were property? How could black people own land if they themselves are being owned by people of European descent, supposedly in the land of the free? So you have to, this conversation starts a conversation about history and the history of land ownership in America. How did a bunch of Europeans come here, establish a legal system, take the land from other groups of people, imprison other people, enslave other people, hold them as property, and now say, well, everyone should have had an equal shot, and it's it's your own fault if you don't have property in this day and age. We know that property is tied to generational wealth. And so if we were excluded from having property for 200 years, for 300 years, how are we expected now to have the same generational wealth as the Europeans that excluded us? That doesn't make sense. If you look at the legal ramifications, okay, let's say what happened back in the 1850s. Let's look at what happened with the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, all right, and how we took land from people that were living there because they legally were like, you can't have it. And so we, by force, took it. By murder, we took it. So then that leads to the Missouri Compromise, because it was like, well, now that we have this new land, are we going to extend the slave states? And it wasn't out of altruism, but there were certain states that were like, we don't want slavery expanding. Why? Because that would have given those slave states more power in Congress. It wasn't because some of these Northerners were like, oh, no, we're pro-black. They weren't. They're African burial grounds that are called African burial grounds in New York. Really, those are slave burial grounds, because all the way up in New York, people had slaves. Up in Pennsylvania, people had slaves. So the Northerners weren't a whole lot better when it comes to certain treatment of people of African descent. And a whole bunch of the abolitionists were on some old like, oh, we don't want slavery because we don't want black people around at all. We want to send them back to Africa shit. They weren't like, well, we don't want slavery because humans are equal. That's a whole nother conversation. But so since 1850, if you look at it, we can start there. You can even go earlier and look at, like, again, how people are property and how land was stolen from the natives here. But then you look at Missouri Compromise. You look at the Homesteading Act, where a whole lot of white people were able to get land as long as they were able to do something with it and maintain it and this and that. When that was passed, black people were still being held in slavery. So a whole bunch of black people didn't have access to the land being granted with the Homesteading Act. Then you look at the Civil War. Okay, we're free. Emancipation Proclamation. We're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. Well, Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated. The next president comes in and says, oh, I'm going to renege on that. We are not giving y'all 40 acres and a mule. That would have been worth trillions of dollars in generational wealth. We didn't get. Then if you look at what happened post-Civil War, well, you would say, well, there's Reconstruction, and that's when black people had some power. During Reconstruction, it was also a way for the North to punish the South and put black people in power without giving them real power and without helping them retain that power and without backing them when the South decided to have that wave of pushback. So you have a decade or two of Reconstruction. Then all of a sudden the Southerners are like, nah, we taking our shit back. And we're going to punish all these black people for trying to think that they had power, for starting their own businesses, and for trying to make any advancements post-slavery. And they started doing stuff to where if you didn't work, then we could put you into jail and then reconstitute slavery. If we find you in certain territories without your paperwork, then we can put you back in slavery, but work camps. There were all these things done in the South to then continue slavery post the Civil War. You know what I'm saying? And then when you start getting into early 1900s, you can look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and how when people started their own businesses, they literally got bombed out. You can look what happened in various areas in the South where black people who were being successful business owners and landowners were run off. The Ku Klux Klan didn't just start in the South. That was just like starting in Ohio. So all through the Midwest and areas that were supposed to be free, they were running black people off their property and scaring them and torturing them and terrifying them and using like acts of terrorism to get black people to give up their land and move to these other big cities and to move farther east or move farther west. If you move through like the early 1900s when folks are coming back from being in the military and there was a GI Bill or there were other incentives to give veterans land access, how were black people treated during that time period? Jim Crow laws were going on. And so literally you can go through every decade post 1850 and see how black people have been marginalized and pushed out of land ownership. Even if you get into modern times with once they did the Equality Acts for housing, and once like the federal government said, fine, you're no longer allowed to just not sell property to black people. You're no longer allowed to openly discriminate against black people. All of a sudden this credit system pops up where for some reason black people have worse credit inherently than white people. How? Oh, that's another way to keep us from owning property. Another way for the banks not to give us the loans. And so when you think about this black land ownership concept, it forces you to learn more about the history of discrimination in this country and the history just in general of imbalance in this country and disparity when it comes to economic access, when it comes to land access. And land is a starting point. If you are into Karl Marx, if you are in any way a Marxist, or if any way you've studied capitalism, not like communism, not like studying down with the capital, no. Just understanding how capital works. It starts with the land and people on the land and the people that work the land. So if we don't own the land, how do we have space to run our own businesses? If we don't own the land, how can we build our own schools? If we don't have the land, where can we live to even come up with these plans for the future? You know what I'm saying? Like, part of this land ownership concept is to go deeper than just like flipping property or just buying something to flip and make a quick buck off of. It's understanding generational wealth and ownership and the reality of until we can move post-capitalism, until we can move past this current time period of saying land can be owned, because that's already a weird concept. That's pretty European in a certain way and pretty colonial. But while that is in place, we have to start thinking about it. And it should open up further discussions. It should start opening up. Well, how do we build solidarity? How do we understand how to start real estate trust? How do we understand how to, instead of letting our neighborhoods get gentrified, coming together as a community, purchasing buildings, and then bringing in vendors, bringing in people that are selling items that are community oriented, bringing in folks who then have an attachment to the community, and bringing in entities that are community based that we support. Because if I right now go try to rent a spot in Williamsburg and it's $8,000 a month for a little tiny 1,000 square foot spot, there's no incentive in that community to make sure I stay there. Whereas if we as a community buy commercial property and then bring in folks that are running businesses that are community oriented and we drive business towards them, give them reasonable rents, all of a sudden gentrification looks different. And it's not re-gentrify the hood with black people. It's the idea of we can put our own money into our communities. And we can utilize the system that's in place in terms of land ownership and tax breaks for people that own property and tax breaks for people that own commercial buildings to our benefit. And to then also think of, well, once we need a retreat, once we want to get out of the city, where are we going to go? You know? So black land ownership to me is a human rights issue. This is about quality of life. This is about access to healthy food. This is about access to space. This is about access to the ability to be self-governed and have autonomy and to decide who are the police in our municipal areas. And just almost any issue that we're having comes down to land. So for folks that would want more information, hit me up. We got plenty of the information. There are tons of articles that get into how the USDA historically has practiced racist policies and have had to settle and have admitted guilt to racist policies and practices. We can talk about how the government has done things to marginalize folks. We can get into the banking systems. We can get into, again, the history behind all this and the necessity for land ownership in the black community worldwide and anywhere where colonialism has happened, how it's affected us. There's a whole situation in Zimbabwe where at a certain point, 4,000 white folks owned over 75% of the land in that country. That's an African country. How's just 4,000 white people own more land than all the Africans there? Look what's happening in South Africa now. Look what's happening in Australia. Look what's happened in Mesoamerica. Look what's happening down in Chile right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is an issue of solidarity, an issue of understanding, like, what are we going to do together in the future? All right. So any questions, hit me up. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Peace. Love.